microphone is stable now. You don't have to worry about it falling on the screen. Today, it gives me great pleasure to make a special announcement, and that is to give a thank you to the Friends of the Library for purchasing the new chairs that you're sitting in. So let's give them a round of applause. And in addition, thanks to the Book Lovers Club of Abingdon, which is celebrating its 100th year this year, for donating the new podium, which was made by Joel Hart, and many of you know, a local artisan, so that was that much more special. So thanks to the Book Lovers for being very generous and helping give a facelift to this room, which was long needed. It does, doesn't it? Also, let me say that if you could complete the survey, we would appreciate it so much. 4 questions that give us a lot of data that we can use in various ways. And in particular, we're interested in having any contact information, emails, if you'd like to receive notifications about other library programs. Now I'd like to introduce Ben Jennings, who will introduce our speaker today.
Yes, it does.
Thank everybody for coming. That's okay. Oh, yeah. Thank everybody for coming. A lot of you I know were here 3 years ago when Amy Greene came with her first novel, Bloodroot. I see lots of heads shaking. And I'm here to tell you that her new novel is, I think, much better than the first one.
I don't know how to feel about that. I'm going to have to mull that over and process.
You like the first one better, huh?
I don't know.
Much better, I think.
Yeah, I think it's the much that's giving me trouble, but go ahead.
Is a bit better.
Okay, that's better.
She's grown. She's grown.
Yeah.
She has grown as a writer, and Long Man, set in East Tennessee in the 1930s, as probably most of you know from reading about it, really does do a good job of capturing the social history of that era, not only there, but in Washington County and the Bristol area when TVA took a lot of farmland and small communities for the river projects. But it's also a wonderful thriller as well. Again, you probably read that a toddler gets lost in the midst of the dam's development and the water rising. So it has much more narrative drive to it than the other. I guess that's what I was hinting at. Maybe a little tighter, taunter book than the other. So welcome Amy Greene, and afterwards book sales and signing and lots of delicious cookies. Welcome Amy Greene.
I've been told that if I breathe on this, it could fall. I still don't trust it completely. But can you all hear me? Okay, and I'll try to be quick so we can get to the cookies. But I just want to say how happy I am to be back here. I was telling Ben earlier that this was one of my absolute favorite places to read, and I really meant that. I really had a great time here last time, and I'm so happy to be back. I was born about an hour down the road in rural East Tennessee, and I grew up on a farm on Mountain Valley Road, if that tells you, if the name tells you anything about the landscape. And I guess because where I come from has in so many ways shaped who I am, I almost can't help but write about it. I spent my childhood really close to nature, exploring the woods around the house that my grandfather built. Even though I'm not part of the generation that was sustained by what they could raise, I still experienced some of that because I would go to work sometimes with my mom in the tobacco fields, and I would pluck the hornworms from the plants and the child's job in the tobacco. And I see people nodding their heads who have actually experienced that, but I thought it was fun, which is probably weird. But as a writer, the landscape of Appalachia became more than a setting to me. It became almost like another character. And for those of you who read Blood Dirt, you know that what a huge inspiration just the geography of home has been to me. So when I started working on this second novel, I found inspiration once again in my own backyard. Longman is what the Cherokees call the Tennessee River, with his head in the mountains and his feet in the sea. And that's the name that I give the fictional river in my novel, and what the book's title comes from. And the book takes place in the Tennessee Valley, my home, during the Great Depression. And it's the story of 3 days in the summer of 1936, as a dam is about to flood a town called Unita, and a little girl goes missing from this town as the water is rising. And I first heard about Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal when I was a little girl myself, and about the Tennessee Valley Authority, because my grandparents on both sides survived the Great Depression in East Tennessee, and they sort of passed down their stories about how the TVA had improved their lives. Because before the TVA came into being in 1933, people in East Tennessee were starving and dying in floods, and dying of malaria, and just struggling to survive on a few $100s a year as subsistence farmers. And my mom tells me that she was 5 when she got electricity, and she said they had one plug, one light bulb, and the electric bill was $1 a month. But the benefits of that power were immeasurable, because the TVA not only modernized East Tennessee, they literally saved lives by bringing flood control and new jobs to the area. So I grew up hearing these stories, and I also grew up surrounded by the dams that they built. In my hometown, we have Cherokee Lake, and when the water is low, you can see the tops of silos out in the middle, rising out of the lake. And it's this ghostly image. They're tagged with graffiti, and I don't know, it has a sort of graveyard feel to it. So, of course, as a child, I was really intrigued by this image. But then, as an adult, I started thinking about the sacrifices that must have been made for the sake of progress in the valley. And when I started doing research on the TVA, I learned that land that had been in families for generations was lost under that water, and there were historical landmarks destroyed to build those dams. There were actually ancient Indian burial mounds destroyed in Norris when the dams were being built. And there were just thousands and thousands of families displaced. In a lot of cases, the bones of people's loved ones were disinterred and moved to other places. So I just imagined what a heartbreak it would be to some people, but then what a blessing it would be to others, because it would have been their best chance to start over somewhere else and to have an easier life. And a lot of questions came up as I was writing Longman about progress and whether or not it's always a force for good. And I think there's no answer to that. I think that's something that you have to determine for yourself, and the characters determine for themselves as the story goes on. But I knew that I wanted to write about the TVA and about a drowning town like the one underneath Cherokee Lake. And as I researched the TVA, something else happened. The plot of Longman sort of came to me in the form of a question. What would happen if a child went missing from a town that was being flooded? But the idea didn't really solidify in my mind until I discovered the character of Annie Clyde Dodson. And she's the young mother whose 3-year-old daughter goes missing as the river rises. And I don't know if other writers would readily admit this, but I think that most novels do have autobiographical elements. Especially with Blood Root, I had people who would ask me, am I in that? And probably the answer is yes. Because you kind of draw from not only bits and pieces of your own life, but from the stories that you hear and the people that you know. And there are definitely pieces of me in this character of Annie Clyde. I gave her my own ideals and my own sort of fear of this big government machine that steamrolls individuals, and I gave her my attachment to home, because as I was learning about the TVA, it occurred to me that the house and the farm that I grew up on is less than 10 miles from the lake. So I couldn't help thinking, where would I be and who would I be if that water had come a little bit farther? And those are questions that I asked about Annie Clyde too. And so I gave her that attachment to home and my heartbreak at the thought of losing it. And there are other women too in Annie Clyde. She was inspired partly by my grandmother, Elva McCoy, who survived the Great Depression by farming alongside her husband to support 8 kids. And my mom tells me that there was, at one time, they took a for sale sign down to the road because they didn't know if they were going to make it, but they couldn't bear to leave it long. They went down there and pulled it up and took it right back. And I talk a lot about my mom because she is a huge inspiration to me. I sort of feel like writing is a calling, and I feel that's been my calling since I was a child, and she felt that same way about teaching. She grew up wanting to be a teacher, but she walked away at a chance at an education because the University of Tennessee wanted her to ask her father to mortgage the farm to pay the tuition, and she refused to do that. But I think probably the strongest model that I found for Annie Clyde was in the TVA caseworker reports that I read as I was doing research. And when the first dam was finished in Norris in 1933, there was one woman named Maddie Randolph who refused to move, and she actually ran off several of the government men with a shotgun. So I just imagine what kind of courage that had to have taken to stand against the government, but also, especially as a woman, and as a marginalized Appalachian woman at that. And so I really wanted to make Annie Clyde Dodson strong like that. But more than anything, I wanted to make her human, and I wanted the humanity of this story to be at the forefront. So I'm going to read a short passage here, and in this passage, this sort of young Greene TVA caseworker named Sam Washburn has come to talk this dangerous woman who ran off her last caseworker with a shotgun into giving up her land.
That was ESPN's news update.
And that did not set up this. Please don't
Expect an exciting sports update.
Okay. All right. Let's start over here. Maybe there should be like a clap of thunder or something. Okay. Washburn started for the porch, but paused when he saw her, already standing there with a dog at her side, as if she'd been waiting, as if she had watched him come. He didn't know how he had failed to notice her there on his way up the track. She seemed to have materialized. What startled him even more than her waiting presence was how little she resembled the farm wife he'd been picturing. She was around his age, in her early 20s. It was her bearing that struck him most, how straight she stood, unlike most of the women in Unita with their backs curved over their sunken bellies. He shaded his eyes against the sun and looked up at her. She towered over him. His first instinct was to turn and go back to the car. There was no way to do what had been asked of him. She would not be moved. He glanced around, hoping her husband was at home. He had read the reports, but nothing prepared him. Something about her fierceness made her beautiful. There was an effort to cross the neglected grass and approach the porch. Its whitewashed posts drifted over with soot. He had already made it farther than the other caseworker without being shot at and forced himself to keep going. Then he saw the gun propped by the front door, and his confidence faltered. It took gumption to set his foot on the bottom step. When the dog began to bark, the woman laid her hand on its broad, reddish head to hush it. Washburn's mouth was dry as he climbed the steps. Standing across from Annie Clyde Dodson, he realized she wasn't as tall as she'd seemed, but she was no less intimidating. She didn't reach for the rifle. She only looked at him. He had thought her eyes were brown, but now, closer up, he saw they were hazel. She wore men's shoes and a faded shift. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and high cheekbones. He was about to speak when a sound came from the open window behind her, like a child crying out in its sleep. The woman glanced over her shoulder. When the cry didn't come again, her eyes settled back on Washburn. Annie Clyde Dodson? Yes? He extended his hand. My name is Sam Washburn. How do you do? I'm tired, she said. He dropped his hand. I know you're just doing your job, but you're not welcome here. But I came a long way to talk to you. She studied him down to his polished shoes. Well, you wasted a trip. He hesitated, choosing his words. He decided to be direct with her. If you're not gone by the 1st of August, you'll be evicted. I'm asking you to hear me out before it comes to that. You all say the same things, she said. I don't need to hear it again. He lifted his hat and scratched beneath it. He didn't know what else to do with himself. The problem is all this rain we've had. It's dangerous to stay here with the reservoir rising. Then I guess you better get on back to Knoxville. Washburn took his coat. I understand your feelings. I grew up on a farm like yours. This is not my farm, she said. Washburn opened his mouth and closed it. I have a little girl. It belongs to her. He cleared his throat. Yes, well, do you want her to see you dragged off in handcuffs? The Dodson woman's eyes caught fire. That's exactly what I want. I want her to see it and never forget it. I want her to know that I fought for what was true. They fell silent, facing each other. There was no sound but the churring cicadas and the panting dog. Washburn wondered if she would reach for the Winchester beside the door, but she kept still. He groped for more to say. She had confused him, made him doubt his reason for being there. Then the noise came again from the house, a child sleepy crying. Some of the fierceness went out of Annie Clyde Dodson. There was a sag in her posture. He stared, unable to help himself, at the freckle on her collarbone, the tendril tucked behind her ear. He saw how thin she was, her cheeks hollow, and the neck of her shift bagging. He could almost feel the weight of her weariness on his own chest. He took a pace backward and then wavered. After 2 years, he still felt like he was proving himself. He didn't want the chief to doubt his competence. More than that, it was humbling to have his authority undermined by a woman of his own age. But she had the soul of one much older. It was clear that he wouldn't be able to sway her. She was right. He had wasted a trip. When he got to the office, he would start the eviction paperwork. The thought made him uncomfortable, as if he had spoken it out loud. He found himself leaving without being told. She didn't have to point her rifle. But as he backed down the steps, the child's cries drifting after him, his eyes played a trick. Somehow the glare of the sun and the shade of the porch made him think he saw water running down the Dawson woman's face. Not pouring on her, but pouring from her, seeping between the fullness of her lips, spouting from her lids to mat her lashes, flowing from the roots of her hair and soaking her dress. The image lasted only until he blinked, but it stayed with him all the way back to Knoxville. Driving away, he was glad to be done with her in the town of Unita. He didn't know then how soon he would see her again. Are y'all still with me? Okay, I'll read my notes. So even as part of this disregarded town in a region that Roosevelt called forgotten by the American people, that's what he said about East Tennessee back in the 30s. And sometimes I fear that that's still true. But Annie Clyde is an outsider. And that's something that I discovered in the writing process that I really wanted to explore in this novel. I found myself touching on class issues and venting some of my own frustrations that I feel the working rural poor are devalued in this country. And at one point I have Annie Clyde ask Sam Washburn, speaking of Gracie, what if her last name was Lindbergh? What would you do for her then? So I wanted to bring up this sort of unfair idea that some people's babies and some people in general are worth less than others. And the character that addresses this most in Longman is the drifter Amos. He's sort of the embodiment of the outsider, I think. He was born in Unita and he comes back to town for unknown reasons 3 days before the town is supposed to be evacuated. And he's mistrusted even in his hometown because he's an orphan and nobody really knows where he came from, and he has a missing eye, he's disfigured, so he's just generally creepy. And So he's almost the embodiment of all the people deemed as sort of unlovable and disposable by society. And his anger at being devalued in this way sort of manifests itself as an opposition to all authority. So he's been a troublemaker all of his life. And although he and Annie Clyde are at odds throughout the novel because she fears and hates him because she suspects him of taking her daughter, as outsiders they sort of have this strange connection. So I'm going to read another short passage here. And in this passage, Amos has come walking into Uneeda thinking that it's already been evacuated, and he's unaware that there's one holdout left. So he stopped to steal corn from Annie Clyde's field. The corn was parting at the end of the row, and he waited for whoever was coming. While his hearing was keen, his eyesight was poor. He couldn't make out what rushed toward him from a distance until it began to bark. It was a red-boned hound, young and gangling, drawn to his stench of rotten wool and wind-scoured stone, the dewy earth that he slept on. Like every drifter, Amos hated dogs. He retreated backward between the stalks, their leaves brushing his shoulders. The big hound advanced on him growling, hunkered down with its hackles raised. He nearly reached the rail fence and was prepared to vault over it when a child came running after the dog. She was small, no more than 3 or 4, wearing a flour sack dress with tousled curls in her eyes. Once she saw what her dog had cornered, not a rabbit or a groundhog, but a man, she stopped in her tracks. The red-boned hound went on growling. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out of it. The last child left in Uneeda. As they studied one another, the clouds that had been gathering all forenoon moved over the cornfield. She seemed more curious than afraid, so he took a step forward. Ignoring the dog, Amos reached into his coat. He pulled out a tin top, a starburst of faded kaleidoscope colors radiating from its knob, gold dulled to brass, blue gone grayish, red aged to flesh, and held it out to her. Without much hesitation, she crossed the short distance separating them as the dog barked harder to warn her off. Amos passed the toy down into her hands as if performing a sacred rite. She accepted it with the same graveness. But then the sharp voice of a woman called out from somewhere close. Amos froze and stood listening with his ear tilted. He could hear someone coming toward them through the field, shaking the corn. "Gracie," she shouted, and whatever spell Amos had managed to cast over the child was broken. She shied away from him, widening the space between them again, her toes printing the furrowed earth in her wake. The hound's barking would lead the woman straight to them. Amos had time to make himself scarce, but he decided to stay and have a look at her. When she finally burst out of the stalks into the row, she was too concerned with the child at first to see him standing there. "Gracie," she panted, "don't you scare me like that." Then she followed the growling dog's gaze, still fixed on Amos, and snatched the child back by the arm. After she'd taken an instant to collect herself, her face hardened. She glared at Amos with recognition. Everyone in Uneeda had seen him at least once. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded. He reached up to break off an ear of corn. "Helping myself to some dinner." The woman clutched the child against her leg. "You're trespassing." He slipped the corn into his pocket and took her in, the thin smock hanging at her knees, the white feather clinging to her shoulder, the flour on her hands. She must have been frying chicken. "I believe I knew your mama," he said. "We used to swim in the river together." She went on glaring at him. "You didn't know my mama." "You look like her," he glanced at the child. "You and your little girl both." "Get off my property," she said. He tipped back his hat to see her better. "Why are you still here? The water will be at your doorstep before you know it." Her face flushed. "You got yourself some dinner, now go on." Amos kept still. "If you're waiting on a fair price for your land, you might as well move. They don't have to give you one." She backed away with the child. "My husband's at the barn. If I holler, he'll come with his gun." Amos could tell that she was lying. Her husband was nowhere around. "Your land is worthless to them," he went on. "So are you and your little girl." The woman had begun to tremble, unable to bluff any longer. In that moment he felt kin to both of them, standing close as the storm moved in. their bodies patterned by the same shade. He glanced again at the child, still holding the kaleidoscope top. Thunder rolled, cornstalks bent and shuffled, as if waiting to see what would happen. At last, Amos stepped forward until he was close enough to count the beats of the young woman's pulse in her neck. When he reached out to pluck a feather from her shoulder, she flinched as if he had struck her. He closed his fingers around it and took up his bindle. That's when the dog lunged, snapping at his shins. Amos felt the bite of the hound's teeth, but he didn't let on. He backed down the road without a sound, keeping his eye on the woman's face. When he reached the fence, he raised himself up on the bottom rail, pausing as if he might change his mind. Then he turned and climbed over into the road, leaving the woman and her child alone in a field that would soon lie hundreds of feet underwater. Okay. Oh, don't applaud yet, because I have like one more small. Okay, your applause, please. Almost over, I promise. And if you'd like to take a nap, go ahead. I don't get offended at all. I've had plenty of family members I'll look at. My Uncle Guy is a really bad one to just go to sleep on. I'm totally used to it.
I took a photo of it. I've got proof.
Yeah, we have photographic proof of that. But as I worked on this historical novel, the challenge became to tell, against the sprawling backdrop of the Great Depression, this more intimate story of a family dealing with tragedy. And having a daughter of my own who was small when I started working on the novel, one of the hardest parts of the process was putting myself in the shoes of this mother whose child disappears. And my very first drafts of Long Man suffered because I wasn't fully able to bring myself to imagine that situation. And then I was faced with a real-life tragedy because my nephew was born with a heart defect, and thankfully he's fine now. But at that time, when I was confronted with the prospect of losing him, I turned to my writing as a way of coping and as almost as a form of therapy, which I sometimes do. And I just poured all of that panic and grief and desperation that I was feeling at that time into this woman's search for her lost daughter. And it was emotionally grueling, but it was necessary for the novel to try to put myself in her place, because I think that if you don't have characters that seem to live and breathe, then the novel has no beating heart. And for me, as both a reader and as a writer, character development takes precedence over everything, because plot is what happens to the characters, and if you don't care what happens to them, then it doesn't matter. So even though there is a sort of tighter time frame for the story, and it has been described as a literary thriller, to me, I still think it's a character-driven story, much like my first novel. So while Long Man is a historical novel, it's also an intensely personal one to me, and it's one of the hardest things that I've ever done, bringing this story and these characters into the world, because I wrote the very first draft way back in 2008, longhand in a notebook, and then it went through 6 intense revisions with my editor. And I think I was talking about this book when I was here 3 years ago, and thinking that it was probably going to come out next year, because I had this crazy idea. It was easier to write a second novel than it was to quickly learned that was not the case at all. So, but it's been such a labor of love, and now I have to give it to readers and see what they make of it. So I'll just read one more very brief passage, and this is from the point of view of Annie Clyde's husband, James, who wants to take Gracie and Annie Clyde to Michigan, where he has a factory job waiting. And he's arguing with his wife about this when a storm breaks loose, and they realize that Gracie isn't in the house anymore. Together they moved through the yard, through the sheeting rain that was plastering their hair to their skulls, running into their mouths and filling their ears. When there was no sign of Gracie, they ran around the side of the house, puddles splashing up their legs. As they reached the elm shading the barn lot, Annie Clyde staggered to a stop. The chain was still wrapped around the base of the trunk, but Rusty was gone. She turned to James with wide eyes. He knew what she was thinking. Someone had let the dog loose. Gracie couldn't unfasten the hasp on the chain by herself. They ran on to the barn where Gracie liked to play sometimes, and stood panting in the opening, water pouring from the eaves. James was certain she would be there. There had been moments of panic before when she was only hiding from them, in the box wagon or the corn crib. But there was nothing in the barn besides the smell of old saddle leather. After that, without even having to speak, Annie, Clyde, and Jane split up. She headed across the hayfield while he went back around the side of the house. He whistled for Rusty under the porch, checked the privy and the hog pen. Everywhere he looked, he expected to find Gracie. He couldn't grasp what was happening. Only minutes ago, he'd been in the kitchen pleading with his wife. He was thinking how foolish he would feel later, after Gracie came out of her hiding place, when Annie Clyde called his name. It was a strangled scream, loud enough to be heard over the downpour. James's throat closed. He ran out to the hayfield, his breath coming in wheezing huffs. Through the weeds, he saw the dark top of Annie Clyde's hair. She was on her knees under the apple tree. He was sure then that Gracie had fallen out of the swing and hit her head. He was sure that he would find Annie Clyde kneeling over their little girl. He was prepared to gather Gracie into his arms and run with her to the truck, praying the road to the doctor's office in Whitehall County would be passable. But when he reached the tree, Annie Clyde hovered over nothing, it seemed, on her hands and knees among the puddles under the lowest boughs where there wasn't enough light for grass to grow. "What?" James shouted at her. "What is it?" She turned her face up to him, drenched hair in strings, shuddering in the cold rain. "Amos," she said. "What are you talking about?" he asked, sinking down beside her. Then he saw it. There in the mud, surrounded by leaves and filled with water, was a single long footprint. Thank you. Questions if anybody has one. And we'll try to avoid that awkward moment where nobody wants to read it. It's going to be the icebreaker. Thank you. Oh, I love you.
Amy, I was wondering, when you write a novel,
Yeah.
do you have the whole plot worked out in your mind and just filling in the spaces, or does it evolve as you write along, so to speak?
I definitely don't begin with a set plan. I try to let it sort of develop organically, because for me, writing is an act of discovery, and it's almost like experimenting in a way. But with this one, because the plot had come to me before the characters, whereas with Bloodroot, the characters came first, I even tried to kind of sit down and write this linear story and begin at the beginning. And I thought I knew how the story was going to end, and when I felt that way, it sort of died for me. It stagnated, and I had to go back to the drawing board, and I had to really, what I had to do was go in, and I did these sort of elaborate character sketches and went really in depth with the characters, because I found if I didn't know them, then I didn't know what they were going to do next. So I kind of let the plot be dictated by the characters and evolved. Otherwise, it's not intriguing for me as a writer. But I'm sort of flaky that way.
That's good. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yeah.
What are you reading?
Oh, okay. The last thing that I read that I was really enraptured with was a book called The Sun by Philip Meyer. It's one of the best books I've ever read. I absolutely love that. Another book that I read recently that I fell madly in love with was Benediction by Kent Haruf. And I love everything that he writes, but that one was especially beautiful and moving. So those were the two.
The Sun, S-U-N or
S-O-N. S-O-N. Philip Meyer. Yep. He's great. He wrote a book called American Rust, too. That was a great one for it.
Do the characters come alive for you? Do they ever talk back to you?
Well, I think in a way they do, because I think there are sort of hundreds of pages even that don't make it into the novel, but that were necessary for me to write. So when they become real like that, in a way they do talk to you, because, as I said before, if you know them well enough, then you can anticipate what they're going to do if you put them in the situations. And, I've heard writers talk about characters taking over, and I actually kind of understand that. That happened to me with my first novel, Bloodroot. I think what happens is you kind of fall in love with a certain character. Like in Bloodroot, I fell in love with the character of Johnny, and so I found that I had written this huge bloated, part 2 of my novel because I was so in love with Johnny. So, and that's when you have to, that sort of old cliche, but that is something that you do have to keep in mind. You have to sort of kill your darlings thing. You have to, and you have to take out that carving tool and try to figure out what should make it to the page in exposition and what can just be shown in the actions of the characters. And that's part of why it took 6 revisions for me, because the characters were talking to me and talking a little too loud, and I was listening a little too much. And you have to rein them in sometimes, and that was part of the editing process for me.
Well, I unfortunately missed your first talk, so you may have already answered this, but do you have any formal training in writing? How to write a
Well,
novel?
I kind of, my path as a writer has been unusual, really. And I've actually been told never to tell aspiring writers this story, but I'm going to break my rule. But I actually, you know, I've always written and told stories my whole life. And I got married right out of high school when I was 18, and I had my first child when I was 20, so I didn't go back to college right away. But I'm a voracious reader, and so I feel reading and writing are very intertwined. So all through my 20s, when I had small children, I was reading constantly, and I feel like that was an education, not formal, but an education. But then there was a point when my daughter was a year old that and there was an actual turning point that I can point to when I decided to go back to school and get training. My son was 7, and we were snowed in, and he was bored, and I told him to write a story because that's what I used to do when I was his age. And I went down in the basement and I had these Rubbermaid tubs full of stories that I wrote when I was in the 1st grade. And I remembered, and I thought of that child, because if you had asked me then and all through, you know, school what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would have said that I was going to be an author. So, but I realized I had let that go, or I kind of let that dream go. And I probably around the next day, I even started, when I kind of revisited those stories and thought about that childhood, you know, dream or what I wanted to do, I went back and started doing research and found this program in Vermont. And I had never been outside the South, so it was kind of an unusual choice to make. But they had, you know, now they have this really good MFA program. They have a low residency MFA. But at that time, they had an undergraduate program called the Adult Degree Program. And you could go and stay 2 weeks twice a year on campus and then come back and do the rest at home. So that was where I learned I was Appalachian, by the way. Because I didn't think I had an accent at all. And at graduation, there was a French-Canadian woman who brought her family in front of me and said, "Talk." But I didn't understand a word she was saying either. So it was okay, because she was French. But but even before and I started working on Bloodroot there when I was in that program. So I don't have an MFA, and even before I had finished my bachelor's degree, I took Bloodroot to the Sewanee Writers Conference in 2007, and that's where I met my mentor, Jill McCorkle. She's a North Carolina writer, and she's somebody else you should read. Put her on your list because she's wonderful. But she saw enough promise in Bloodroot that she told me when I finished it she would put me in touch with an agent. So she actually, and I went home, finished the novel really fast so she wouldn't forget that she told me that, and she made good on that promise, and she introduced me to an agent, and it happened really fast actually, because I got home from Sewanee in August, I finished Bloodroot in September, and then by the beginning of October, the day before, I've probably told this story a million times to people in this room, but I actually got my agent at Dollywood because I had my cell phone with me. I don't have a landline. So when my agent called to represent me, I was at Dollywood and on like the day before my birthday, and I thought that I would be unsophisticated if I was at Dollywood. So I was trying to hide from the music and not let her know where I was. But then the train came through and she asked me if I was on a train, so I had to tell her where I was. But it turned out okay because she's a huge Dolly fan. So anyway, so I had the agent by the beginning of October, and then by the beginning of November I had a book deal with my publisher, with my editor at Knopf. So it was a sort of whirlwind experience, and I had to. So I don't have any formal. I don't have any formal training in writing. You know, I have a liberal arts degree, but and I've debated on going back and doing the MFA. But I feel like if I continue to read, I think that's how I'll grow as a writer. I never stop, and I don't think you're ever finished. I don't think it's ever. No matter how much training you have, I think if you start to feel complacent or feel like or feel like you have enough training, or because I just think it's never over, So I continue to learn. I'll take one more question.
Are you working on something new now?
I am, but I made a promise to myself because last time when I was working on Blood Root, I told everybody about this book. And so, and I told, like, I was really elaborate. I was really getting some now I'd be like, and I would tell people it's going to be published, tomorrow. And so people ask me throughout the years, when's Longman coming out? And then that would kind of make me want to kill myself because I thought it may never come out. So, but I am working on something else, and I will say it's been a different experience because with these two novels, with Blood Root, it's a multi-generational story, and I began in the Depression and moved forward to the present. And then with this one, with this historical novel, I kind of concentrated on the Depression. But I really wanted to tell a contemporary Appalachian novel this time, and even more autobiographical novel in a way, because I wanted to write about my upbringing and growing up in the 80s and the 90s and the present and the issues that we deal with. And also, I sort of have had this crutch with the other two novels that I've fallen back on of multiple narrators. So it's been a really interesting experience to write a coming-of-age story from one point of view with a character who sort of carries the story. So I'm really learning and growing a lot by taking that approach and working on this third novel. But I will take one more because I saw your hand.
Tell us about your research with the TVA caseworkers and how useful that was, and how you use research.
Yeah, well, in my research process, I try not to rely too much on the sort of historical textbooks, because I did want the humanity of the story to come first. And I feel like you can get really bogged down if you go too deep into the facts. And you do want historical accuracy, of course, and there's a responsibility because people have lived through this moment in history, and I wanted to get it right. But I did concentrate more on those collected interviews, and there was this one book that I relied on a whole lot. It was called TVA and the Dispossessed. Are you familiar with it? And it was a collection of interviews, from the people who had lived through it. And the caseworker reports, what was really interesting about that is they were actually available online. I could do a search and read about Maddie Randolph and people like her. But something else that I found really helpful was books of photography from that time. The WPA put out, these great books, and Dorothea Lange's photos from the Depression. And what I found was that looking at the faces, really was invaluable, and of course the atmosphere. I could really put myself in the era even just by looking at it and trying to absorb it that way. Well, thank you all so much. I think I'm supposed to sign books now, and y'all enjoy books.